I don't just hate you, coward. You're afraid to marry me. You'd rather live with that silly little fool who can't open her mouth except say yes.
Long before audiences ever saw Scarlett O'Hara framed in Technicolor, Gone with the Wind was already burning. On one of the most famous nights in the film's production, the cameras rolled on the destruction of Atlanta, while the movie still did not have its Scarlett. Flames tore through old studio sets. Producer David O. Selznick was spending money at a terrifying rate, and one of the biggest films in Hollywood history was moving forward without the woman who would have to carry it. Then, through the glow of that manufactured inferno, Vivien Leigh arrived on set with Myron Selznick. Later, the legend would harden around a single line: "Genius, meet your Scarlett O'Hara." Whether that moment has been polished by time or not, the pressure behind it was real. There had already been a nationwide search. Fans, actresses, studio insiders, and gossip columnists had all turned the casting into a public obsession, and until Leigh's arrival, Paulette Goddard was widely seen as the leading contender. That is what makes this story so irresistible. The public remembers Vivien Leigh as if she were always destined for the role, as if Scarlett and Leigh arrived together, fully formed, in the same myth. But behind the legend was a production that had drifted into uncertainty before it had even properly begun. A British actress being considered for the South's most fiercely protected heroine, a producer drowning in expectation, and a casting decision so controversial that protest letters poured into Selznick's office before the film was even finished. How did the most iconic performance in Gone with the Wind come from a choice so risky, so resented, and so unnervingly late? And what does it reveal about the kind of Hollywood that could turn panic into destiny? To answer that, we have to go back to the moment when America was not yet looking at its Scarlett, but still searching for her. By the time Gone with the Wind reached theaters in late 1939, it did not feel like an ordinary release. It felt like an event large enough to dominate the entire industry. Margaret Mitchell's novel had already become a sensation after its publication in 1936, and David O. Selznick's adaptation arrived wrapped in prestige, scale, and expectation. It was presented as something bigger than a romantic drama, a lavish historical epic, a major studio gamble, and a cultural landmark before audiences had even seen the final frame. The response was enormous. The film became a box office phenomenon, won 8 competitive Academy Awards from 13 nominations, and secured a place among the most celebrated American films ever made. Decades later, the American Film Institute would still rank it among the greatest in the national canon, while many modern sources continue to describe it as the highest-grossing film in history when adjusted across re-releases and changing ticket prices. Part of that power came from the way the film seemed to offer everything at once. It had spectacle, romance, war, glamour, and the kind of emotional scale Hollywood rarely attempted with such confidence. It also had a heroine the audience could not easily dismiss. Scarlett O'Hara was difficult, vain, resilient, selfish, magnetic, and unforgettable. She was not a gentle symbol of old Southern nostalgia. She was movement, appetite, survival. Paired with Clark Gable's Rhett Butler and photographed in lush color, the film gave viewers a version of old Hollywood grandeur that felt almost too complete to question. It became, in public memory, the kind of classic that looked inevitable from the start. Even its honors helped strengthen that myth. It was the first color film to win Best Picture, and Vivien Leigh's performance quickly became inseparable from the film's identity. But that public image hid a far less stable reality. The finished film looked majestic, self-assured, almost fated. The casting of Scarlett looked, in retrospect, like destiny. It was anything but. Before Leigh, the role had already become one of the most feverishly contested parts in Hollywood, with a nationwide search, a small cluster of serious finalists, and Paulette Goddard still standing as Selznick's leading choice until late in the process. Even after Leigh emerged, the decision was not greeted with universal excitement. A British actress playing the South's most mythologized heroine sparked resistance before the film was even completed. The movie the public embraced as seamless had, at its center, been built on uncertainty, and that uncertainty is where the real story begins. The pressure behind this casting did not begin with Vivien Leigh. It began with David O. Selznick, who had taken on a project so large that it was already threatening to outgrow the man producing it. Margaret Mitchell's novel had become a phenomenon almost instantly, and once Selznick bought the screen rights, He was no longer making just another prestige picture. He was trying to satisfy readers who felt proprietary about every character, every image, and especially the woman at the center of it all. Even Turner Classic Movies described Scarlett O'Hara as the most difficult element of the adaptation to cast, with virtually every actress and many women who were not actresses at all imagining themselves in the role. And Scarlett was only one part of the problem. Selznick also needed Clark Gable for Rhett Butler, but Gable was under contract to MGM, and even he initially resisted the role. Britannica notes that Gable first declined it, wary of period pictures, and doubtful that any film version could survive the expectations surrounding the book. At the same time, The Atlantic records that fan mail was flooding Selznick's office, and that the overwhelming majority of it demanded Gable as Rhett. So the production was boxed in from both directions. The public thought it already knew who Rhett should be, while Selznick still did not know who Scarlett could be. Before the film could even settle into production, its two leads had already become a referendum on whether Hollywood could be trusted with a beloved American myth. That is what turned the search for Scarlett into something more dangerous than ordinary casting. It became public theater. The Harry Ransom Center shows just how narrow the serious field eventually became, with Paulette Goddard, Jean Arthur, Joan Bennett, and Vivien Leigh emerging as the true finalists. More importantly, it notes that until Leigh's arrival, Goddard was Selznick's first choice. So when Leigh entered the picture, she was not replacing a vacuum. She was stepping into a role that already had a frontrunner, a fan culture, and a producer who could not afford to look unsure. Then came the most explosive complication of all. Leigh was British. As the Ransom Center also documents, once word spread that she was being considered, letters protesting the idea poured into Selznick's office, forcing him to defend her publicly before audiences had seen a single finished scene. So the real pressure behind the camera was not simply about finding a talented actress. It was about finding a woman who could survive the burden of national expectation, studio anxiety, regional sentiment, and one producer's fear of getting the biggest decision in the film disastrously wrong. Leigh was walking into a role that was already half legend and half minefield, and that is why, once the production truly began to move, even a promising choice was never going to be enough. The machinery around Gone with the Wind was already too large, too public, and too tense to stay balanced for long. At first, the machinery looked almost impressively controlled. Selznick had the rights to the most talked-about novel in America, a public already emotionally invested in every character, and a casting process so visible it could be sold as part of the event itself. A nationwide search for Scarlett O'Hara gave the impression of confidence, as if Hollywood were calmly and methodically choosing the perfect woman for the role. But hidden inside that spectacle was the first real danger. The search was becoming a story of its own. The more public it became, the less freedom Selznick had to make a quiet decision. Every fan suggestion, every gossip column, every screen test only raised the stakes. Instead of narrowing the chaos, the process began feeding it. And yet, for a while, it still seemed manageable. Scores of women read for the part, but only a much smaller group sat for filmed screen tests, and eventually the field tightened around a handful of serious contenders. Paulette Goddard began to look like the practical answer. According to the Harry Ransom Center, she made more screen tests than any other established actress and even signed an option agreement in anticipation of getting the role. On paper, that should have brought the uncertainty to an end. But that was exactly where the production began to slip. Goddard was not a decisive triumph. She was a near solution in a production that could not afford nearly. Selznick still hesitated, and once a producer starts hesitating that late, everyone around the film can feel it, even when nothing has officially gone wrong yet. Then came the kind of moment that makes a production look cursed, even before the public knows it is unstable. Filming began on December 10, 1938, with the burning of Atlanta sequence, one of the only major scenes that could be shot before Scarlett had been officially cast. It is one of those extraordinary details that sounds almost too perfect to be true. Gone with the Wind, quite literally, began with fire, while still missing the woman at its center. Around that same moment, Vivien Leigh entered the picture through Myron Selznick, and the mythology began forming almost instantly. TCM notes the famous story that Myron brought her to the burning of Atlanta set and introduced her as Scarlett, while history records that David O. Selznick asked her to test after she arrived. Whether one prefers the legend or the paperwork, the larger truth is the same. The production was already moving before its emotional center had settled. That was the deeper crack. The movie no longer had the luxury of solving its biggest problem in private. Vivien Leigh may have impressed Selznick, but her emergence did not calm the situation. It transformed it. She was talented, ambitious, startlingly right in ways some insiders immediately recognized. But she was also British, and Scarlett O'Hara was not just another heroine. She was treated almost like cultural property. Once word spread that Leigh was being seriously considered, protest letters began pouring into Selznick's office. Some objected openly to the idea that anyone other than a native Southern woman should play Scarlett. Selznick found himself doing something producers hate to do before a film is even safely underway, defending a choice before he had publicly finalized it. He circulated arguments about Leigh's background, her suitability, even the perceived kinship between English and Southern identity. In other words, the casting decision was no longer simply artistic. It had become political, regional, and public all at once. And that is how the production started to lose its balance. Not through one dramatic collapse, not yet, but through a chain of smaller instabilities that kept hardening into larger ones. A search designed to build anticipation had built pressure. A frontrunner had emerged without ending doubt. A film had started shooting without its central actress fully in place. And when the right candidate finally appeared, she arrived carrying a new risk the production had not solved, only exchanged. What looked from the outside like a glamorous casting saga was, from the inside, a film inching forward while its most important decision was still volatile. The cameras were rolling, the myth was growing, and the production had begun to understand that finding Scarlett was not the end of the problem. It was the moment the real consequences would begin. The moment everything turned did not happen in a casting office. It happened in firelight. On December 10th, 1938, Gone with the Wind began filming with the burning of Atlanta sequence, one of the only major scenes that could be shot before Scarlett O'Hara had officially been cast. That alone tells you how unstable the situation had become. Selznick was no longer searching for Scarlett at a safe distance from production. The film had already begun moving without its central woman in place. Then, into that strange and expensive spectacle, came Vivien Leigh, brought to the set by Myron Selznick. Turner Classic Movies preserves the famous version of what happened next. Myron supposedly introduced her to his brother with the line, "Genius, meet your Scarlett O'Hara." But even there, the wording is treated as legend. What is solid is the larger fact beneath it. Leigh arrived at precisely the moment when the production could no longer afford uncertainty. And from that point on, the search was no longer theoretical. It had become urgent. That is why this was more than a glamorous discovery story. Until Leigh appeared, Paulette Goddard had been Selznick's first choice. The Harry Ransom Center notes that Goddard made more screen tests than any other established actress, signed an option agreement in anticipation of getting the role, and stood among the final 4 serious contenders alongside Jean Arthur, Joan Bennett, and Leigh. In other words, the production already had a likely path forward. It was not waiting for a miracle. It was waiting for Selznick to commit. Leigh's arrival shattered that fragile balance. She did not emerge from nowhere because all other possibilities had failed. She emerged because a production that thought it was nearing a decision suddenly saw a more dangerous, more exciting answer. Once that happened, the original plan could no longer hold. The frontrunner was no longer enough. Selznick had seen a different Scarlett. And this is where Hollywood legend and documented reality begin to overlap. According to Turner Classic Movies, Leigh was told she had the part on Christmas Day, 1938. Yet the Smithsonian marks January 13th, 1939, as the date the announcement was made public. That gap matters. It suggests that even after the emotional decision had been made, Selznick still had to manage the public consequences of it. He was not simply unveiling a new star. He was preparing to defend one. Because the turning point in this story was not just that Vivien Leigh won the role. It was that the production chose to anchor its most important character in a woman many people believed had no right to play her. Scarlett O'Hara was seen by readers as intensely Southern, intensely American, almost proprietary. Leigh was English. The role had passed from a likely Hollywood choice into the hands of a British actress at the center of America's most mythologized Civil War romance. That was not a tidy ending to the casting problem. It was the beginning of a new one. The backlash proved it immediately. The Harry Ransom Center documents that when word spread Leigh was being considered, letters opposing the choice poured into Selznick's office. He had to defend her before the audience had even seen her performance. This is one of the most revealing parts of the whole saga, because it shows exactly when the film's mythology was rewritten. Selznick was no longer merely choosing an actress from a list. He was arguing with the public about who Scarlett O'Hara could be. He tried to neutralize the resistance by pointing to Leigh's background and even by making cultural arguments about her suitability. Whether those arguments persuaded anyone in the moment is almost beside the point. What mattered was that the casting had crossed into open controversy. The search that began as a publicity engine had now produced a result the producer had to politically sell. That was the real turning point. The instant the casting decision stopped being private judgment and became a battle over ownership, identity, and trust. And yet, this is also the point where the film that history remembers truly came into focus. Because once Leigh was chosen, the movie acquired a center it had been circling without reaching. Turner Classic Movies notes how relentlessly she worked during the shoot, and Olivia de Havilland later remembered that Leigh could sit through long delays, rise, and enter a scene at full intensity almost instantly. That matters because Gone with the Wind did not need merely a beautiful star. It needed an actress who could survive scale, pressure, rewrites, exhaustion, and the burden of being watched as if the nation itself were judging the result. The late decision changed the final movie because it changed the force at its center. What audiences later experienced as inevitability was, in truth, the result of a gamble made when the production was already in motion, already under pressure, and already too large to retreat. Scarlett O'Hara did not arrive as the graceful conclusion to a search. She arrived as the answer that forced every other version of the film to disappear. What it cost was not only anxiety inside the production, but legitimacy. Vivien Leigh did not step into Gone with the Wind as a universally embraced answer. She stepped into it under suspicion. Before audiences ever saw her on screen, Selznick was already absorbing the backlash of having chosen an English actress for a role many readers considered almost sacredly Southern. Protest letters arrived from viewers who saw the choice as a violation of ownership, not simply a disagreement in taste. That matters, because it tells us the casting did not solve the film's biggest tension in a clean, triumphant way. It merely changed the form of the pressure. The burden shifted from finding Scarlett to justifying her. And the public story later softened that truth, almost beyond recognition. What Hollywood mythology prefers is inevitability. The right woman appeared. The producer recognized genius. History was made. But the documents tell a more fragile story. Paulette Goddard had been Selznick's first choice before Leigh's arrival. She had tested extensively, moved deep into the process, and stood close enough to the part that the production had reason to believe the search was nearly over. Leigh did not emerge because the film was patiently waiting for destiny. She emerged because a production already under strain abandoned the comfort of its likely answer for a riskier, more electric one. That is a very different kind of Hollywood story. It is not a story about certainty. It is a story about instinct under pressure, and about how often the industry later disguises gamble as fate. What that gamble created, of course, was enormous. Gone with the Wind became not merely a hit, but one of the defining successes of classical Hollywood. The film won 8 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, and Vivien Leigh won Best Actress for Scarlett O'Hara. Turner Classic Movies describes the performance as the one that turned her from a virtual Hollywood unknown into one of its greatest stars. In other words, the same decision that had to be defended before release became inseparable from the film's triumph after release. The controversy was not erased, but it was overwhelmed by the force of the result. Leigh did not simply survive the burden of the role. She absorbed it and transformed it into the performance most people now think of when they think of Scarlett at all. And that may be the most revealing thing this story says about Hollywood. Great films are often remembered as monuments of confidence, when in truth they are built out of uncertainty, improvisation, and decisions made before anyone can know whether they are wise. The hidden reality behind Scarlett's casting is not just that Selznick nearly chose someone else. It is that the finished film gained something from that instability. This is an inference, but a grounded one. Leigh's Scarlett feels dangerous because the casting itself was dangerous. She does not play the character like a polished studio ornament. She plays her with appetite, will, and volatility. and that force became central to why the performance endured. The gamble cost the production peace. It gave the film its center. What was left behind, in the end, was not just one of the most famous performances in Hollywood history. It was a myth so complete that it almost erased the uncertainty that created it. Today, most people do not think of Vivien Leigh as the risky choice for Scarlett O'Hara. They think of her as Scarlett. The distinction has vanished. Time has a way of doing that to old Hollywood. It takes struggle, hesitation, controversy, and panic, and turns them into inevitability. What once felt like a gamble begins to look like destiny. But that is exactly why this story still matters. Because behind the polished legend of Gone with the Wind is a truth that says something deeper about the studio era at its height. These films were not always built by calm certainty or grand design. They were often built by pressure, by instinct, by executives making decisions before the ground beneath them felt stable, by productions moving forward even when their most important problems had not truly been solved. Vivien Leigh's casting was not the final, elegant flourish on a machine working perfectly. It was the moment a film, under enormous strain, found the one presence strong enough to hold its center. And that may be the real afterimage of this story. Not the famous entrance, not the studio legend, not even the victory that followed, but the idea that one of the most immortal images in cinema was born at the edge of doubt. A British actress stepped into a role many people thought she should never play, on a production already too massive, too public, and too emotionally charged to fail quietly. And somehow, out of that tension, Hollywood got the performance it would spend decades pretending had been obvious all along. That is what was really left behind. Not just a classic, but a reminder that the screen often hides the fear that shaped it. And sometimes the most enduring legends are the ones that, for a brief moment, looked like terrible ideas. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe, share your thoughts in the comments, and turn on notifications for more hidden stories from behind Hollywood's most iconic films.